afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming. I feel so good about this event, so good about having you here that I let my wife talk me into a bow tie. So this is a big day for me. If you came yesterday, and I hope you did, you heard Kevin Alexander Gray talk about symbolism in public policy, and it was a challenging and frank and kind of wide-ranging conversation and got this symposium off to a great start. It concluded with the idea that we need to talk to each other and listen to each other, and that's why we're having it. And while I wish more people were here to talk and listen to each other, I'm certainly glad that you came. On behalf of Marion University, welcome and thank you for coming. A little bit of business before we begin. In your programs, there is an evaluation sheet. Our generous grant from South Carolina Humanities requires us to insert that into your program and ask that you please fill that out at the end of the session. There's a box right in the middle of the room that you'll run into if you're not watching where you're going. It was carefully placed there so that you'll please remember to place an evaluation in there. There's also comment cards on campus in the McNair Science Building. We have a board. We're calling it the charge board. We invite you to write an idea, a suggestion, or a charge for moving forward, having heard what you've heard today and perhaps yesterday. And we'll pin those to the board and leave them up for as long as we can until somebody makes us move the board somewhere else. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to introduce Reverend Merritt Graves, who will deliver the invocation. Reverend Graves.
Let us pray. To you, O God, who is everlasting, you're gracious, you're understanding, and forgiving. We ask your blessings upon this event, all of its participants, those whose vision has become a reality through this forum. We thank you for this great institution, Marion University, that has become a beacon of light in this community, this region, this state, and this nation. It's become a training ground for leaders. But today, Lord, and for all of our days, we ask you to open up our minds and our hearts, that we may learn to see each other through your eyes, and that we may learn to show each other the love that you have shown each of us. In Jesus' name, amen.
A little about our format. We'll begin with a 45-50-minute presentation today by Dr. Leo Graves, yesterday by Kevin Alexander Gray, tomorrow by the legendary Dr. Cleveland Sellers, who will be joining us to talk about education and race and culture. Dr. Leo Twiggs' biography is printed in your program, so I'm not going to read that to you, except to mention that he is, I think, the only two-time recipient of the Elizabeth O'Neill Verner Award, the highest award given to an artist in this state, and the Order of the Palmetto, the highest civilian award in the state of South Carolina. Instead of introducing him conventionally, I'd like to show you a video.
Charleston is a unique place in the history of African Americans. It is the place where the slave ships brought Africans to this country, head to toe, like sardines, and then docked in Charleston. This is where they began their long and agonizing journey into the night. When these slaves got off the boat and they got into the Christian religion, at the beginning, this was their sanctuary. This was where they began to feel something about Christ and about the deliverance from their daily routine, from the hardships, from the pain. What happened at Mother Emanuel is not unique to African Americans. It is a part of the journey from which we've come. This is a crisis of multiple meanings. It's redemption, it's slaughter, it's tears, it's all of those things. James Weldon Johnson wrote a poem in 1900 called Lift Every Voice and Sing. Two verses stand out. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. That is the story of Mother Emanuel. That is a story of many African Americans, especially in churches. The church is the sanctuary. Sometimes African Americans wear a mask when they're outside. They smile and they hurt and they cross over things. But in the church, they could release themselves. And that is why this series has been so important and so difficult to me. What happens 50 years from now when the viewer looks at these paintings? Can an artist invest in them the humanity, the tragedy, the pain, the suffering that he felt when he painted Mother Emanuel? Can he elicit these kinds of reactions from viewers even after they have forgotten what Mother Emanuel was like? The viewer who looks at the work brings his own experiences to what the artist has produced. But Mother Emanuel is important because that is the place where so much of our history occurred. That is the place that connects almost directly to that ship that I spoke to you about. So the shooter knew that, and he wanted to get that kind of impact. But the grace of Mother Emanuel is the thing that carried us through the day and the thing that America sees now. But how did they arrive at that place? How do you arrive at having somebody kill your loved ones, slaughter them, walking in that blood, and then coming to a point where you say, I forgive them? And that's what I struggle with. That's why doing this series is perhaps the most difficult thing I've attempted. Because as I moved through the series, I knew that I had to transition from the bloodiness, the ghastly horror of its beginning to the beauty of its ending. And to do that, I had to find a way using color and shape and form to do that. We know that 9 people died, so the figure 9 is there. We know how they died, and so the flag is there. We know that it was targeted, so the target is there. And what I feel is that the tragedy changed our state in a way that I had not seen before. I think for us that was a shining moment where people came together, not because of the color of their skin, but because the humanness in their heart. I think for the first time we started communicating with each other heart to heart instead of head to head. At least for one shining moment, we came together. And I hope that the series records that moment. If anything can be taken away from the series, it can be said that it records our finest moment. And if people remember that, then as an artist, I will be completely satisfied.
The series you're seeing is called Requiem for Mother Emanuel, reproductions of which are hanging in the Morris Gallery of the Florence Public Library, along with portraits of the Emanuel 9 victims, the originals having been obligated to the South Carolina State Museum. If you can't see the reproductions this week, please go see the originals at the South Carolina State Museum. I am pleased now to welcome to discuss the topic of art, community, and healing, Dr. Leo Twiggs.
Hello. Sure glad to see all of you here. This is a little ways from Charleston, where this all began, but it's not that far away, because I was born right between this in a little town called St. Stephen's. But before I do that, let me give some thanks and some love to some people who were so important to me getting here, and that's John, who stayed on my case from the moment he asked me to come. I got emails. He wanted to make sure everything was all right. I found out from one of his assistants, students said, John is just a warrior, that's all. But he was so great at getting us here, and he sent Sherry, who came with this morning and picked us up, and just took us everywhere we wanted to go and told us her story, and it was one of those inspiring ones. And then to the people who came here today, because, you know, I have 5 brothers and a sister, and 2 of my brothers are here today. One lives right here in Florence, and that's my brother George and my brother Willie, and his son Marcus is here. So I want to say thank you to them. Would they stand up, guys, so folks can see you? There they are right there. Whenever I'm close by, we always have a little reunion. And then I have a student here, Francis, who has grandchildren. Can you imagine? Great-grandchildren, I think. Yes, you have. Francis Thomas. Will you stand, Francis? I always like to connect with my students when I'm at places. And finally, you know, if you read about artists, if they're doing any significant work, usually they're vagabonds guys who just go from place to place, and they have no roots, and they might leave and not come back for days and all of that. But I had somebody in my life who kept it together for me. I have 3 sons. They all graduated from college, all doing well. I've spent a lot of time in the studio. I went away to University of Georgia, and she had to keep it all together. And as an artist, you know, you get idiosyncratic at times, and I spend time in the studio because you have to be involved, as you saw in the video. But she was there all the time. She is there now. She's been there for 56 years. And if I seem to fly today, it's because she is and has always been the wind beneath my wings. Would you stand up there? Mother Emanuel, for me, was more than something that just began on a television screen one night when this tragedy occurred. Arthur Rowe was my art teacher at Claflin University, and my mentor was a member of Mother Emanuel, and I had gone there early on when his relatives died, and I knew of the church. But when the tragedy happened, it put it all in a very new light. And so I began to do something about that, about feeling what was going on there. And so I did one painting, and that painting started with the number 9 and a target. I have some slides to show you, and I want to walk through these slides with you and talk about getting into this particular program of finding my way through it. There are 9 paintings here, but they're not sequential. They are testimonies to what I felt at the particular moment. You know, when I was growing up in St. Stephen's, my mother and father were members of a holiness church, and every Sunday they would ask you to testify. And you'd get up and you'd tell what the Lord did for you that week. And you'd talk about what you expect the Lord to do for you the next week. But you testify. But you can't testify unless you have a test. You don't have a testimony unless you had a test. And so the test for me was Mother Emanuel. How do I take this and put this into some meaningful form? And so it started with one painting, then another painting, then another painting. And then from there it went. So, John, if we can do the slides now. I want to start with this because I think it's important to know that art is a journey. You don't go there, you arrive there. You arrive at places. For instance, I'm from Orangeburg, and if you go to Orangeburg, there is in Orangeburg, see that statue over there? There is that statue over there that's right down at the City Hall, right across from, right on the square across from the big church. And then right next to it, you notice that I used that statue again, but it always reminded me that beneath that statue was a commemoration of Confederate soldiers. And so I created the oval and put the Confederate soldiers there. Next slide. And so back in as early as the 1970s, right after I got out of graduate school at the University of Georgia, I began painting the Confederate flag. Now, the Confederate flag that you see there is maybe different from the ones that you notice. They're not polyester, brand new flags. They are old, tattered. I wanted to paint it as if you open a trunk and you took this flag out, and this flag was used in 1860, 1861, and your great-grandfather might have been a general or a soldier, and you kept it all those years, and it would be tattered and torn, and it would be faded, and some of the edges would be gone. So I wanted to paint it as an heirloom from the past, as an image from the past. And so in both of these pieces that you see here, and they're dated 70, 71, you see the flag, and you also see faded images of people from that particular era. Next slide, please. And then I began to paint the flag all by itself. Now, if you notice here, I have taken the colors out of it, and I often wondered, would the flag have the same power if you took out the red, white, and blue? What happened if you changed the colors? If you change the way you look at things, then the thing you look at can change. And so what I tried to do was to take away the color and put it. I remember the cotton fields that I grew up in. And so I thought about it as taking this flag and making it like a cotton field down south. Next slide. Now this one doesn't have that. And this one I used for pattern material. And again, you see the flag as if it is deteriorating. An image from another era. And I do it like this, and it works, I think, better than putting paint on because I work with wax and dyes on fabric. My paintings are not paint on paper or canvas. So with dyes, the dyes seep into the surface of the fabric, and therefore you get multi-layers of things. And when I put wax on the fabric, and wax is a resist, and I crush the fabric in my hand and dip it in there, the dyes seep into the cracks, and therefore you get that crackle effect that is characteristics of batik. So I could create the aging process that way. Next slide. And then I started doing targets, targeted man. I always felt about targeting is that Ku Klux Klan used to target African-American communities to intimidate us. They would march, they would burn the cross, they would wear sheets. They had this stereotypical idea about African-Americans that they're scared of ghosts, and so when we look closer, they'll run. And many of them would go inside and would shut the doors. When it happened, they would always tell us, go inside, close the doors. So we were targeted that way. And then 9/11 came. And the towers came down. And many people in this country felt that we were targeted now. Americans were targeted. And so, even though we never called the Ku Klux Klan terrorists, they were. And now we were all haunted by terrorists. So I just felt now people knew what it felt like to us. Because I believe in this issue of race, one of the things that we don't understand is we don't understand how other people feel. We can't empathize enough to put ourselves into their shoes. I remember Chris Rock on one of his shows said, "You don't want to be me, and I'm rich." So nobody wants to exchange places. And until you find a way to exchange places, you won't understand the pain, the second-classness of it all. And so if you look at the targeted figures, they're shadowy. You don't know whether they're friend or foe. You don't know what country they came from. You can suggest that, but they're just there, and they are hidden, and it looks sinister, and you can be confused about who they are. Next slide. And so when I did the targets, our children were targeted, and sometimes a targeted person just emerged out of the darkness and then go back into the darkness. You don't usually know who they are or what they are. And so I tried to create this sinister kind of presence of these people that are in there. But for even young kids, young African Americans, now they were targeted because they're in poor schools, targeted because they don't get all the rights that they need to get, targeted because they don't get the jobs. And so this is what I tried to show in this particular work next to it. Next slide. Now, I have shown you all of this to let you know about the journey. I did not come to the Mother Emanuel series just say, well, I think I'm going to paint me 9 paintings about Mother Emanuel. All of this stuff happened 1969, 1970, all the way up through the 80s, the targeted man through the 80s. And so I had been painting targets. I had been painting flags. And this became like the perfect point where all of this welled together. At this time in my career, I am so amazed at what the Mother Emanuel series has done, because I have the series traveled to Spartanburg. It ended up on Monday Night Football. CBS came and did a special on it at the end of one of its newscasts. I was in Alabama, Auburn, Alabama. In every place, it was used as a catalyst for a conversation about race. And that, to me, means so much. And so after working on targets, working on the flag, then I came to all of this after I saw Mother Emanuel. And the first one I did was this one that you see here. There is the target, and around the target you see that messy stuff, because I tried to imagine what the scene looked like with 9 people on a concrete floor, dead. What happened when they went in there the first time? And then underneath it was a sacred place. So I cut a hole into the painting and inserted a cross and a brooch and just some things that people would have worn to church. One of those things, that black things that you can't see there, is something that my grandmother would have worn on her dress. Next slide. And then from there, I did this slide, this work. Amazingly, that first work was purchased by an architect in Nashville. And another person who had purchased my work earlier told my gallery director that if he ever does anything with a flag about Mother Emanuel, I want to purchase it. I didn't even know he said that, but that was just the next step because I had done targets. And so here is the flag, and there the number 9. Because to me, the 9 was so important because it represented the 9 lives. And the background, if you notice, there is the steeple of a simulation of a church. Next slide. And then I did this very small painting. And this small painting is a turning point in the whole series because a friend of mine, Lucy Whittle from Greenville, was on the board at Palmetto. And she said, I'm on the board. They've had some slide works there, but they don't have anything that I think is reputable. I would like for you to donate a painting to this auction for the festivals, Palmetto Festival. And I don't usually donate things because when you donate things, they sell them cheaper. And then your gallery director gets mad because she's charging one thing and you do. So I don't usually do that. But Lucille, Jennifer was really very adamant about it. And she said, well, you have to do this. And she was a good friend, and so I did. And I took this painting, and it was small, so I said, okay, it's small. I'll let you have a small painting. And they did it on auction, and the painting is 14 by 19, and it sold for $14,500. And I didn't get any of that money. Remember, it was an auction. But after she came back, she said, people were so taken by that. Have you considered doing 9? Well, 9 is a real stretch for me because a batik painting, like the ones you saw, this probably took about 2 weeks to do. The one you saw earlier took about 3 weeks to do. The big ones take sometimes a month to do because you have to wait for the dyes to dry and all that. But I was intrigued by the 9. If you notice, I had 9 on one of the paintings there. And then I started working on them. And the next slide is the one I did, the first one I did after that. And in this one, I don't know why I did that. It's rather austere, but I still remember the bloodiness of that place. And I also remember that the X that creates the Confederate flag can also mark the spot where somebody could have died. Because when the police go to a place, they might mark a place where a bullet hole went, or mark a place where somebody lay after they were shot or killed in some way. And then I put the 9 X's there to note that 9 people died. And if you notice the background, there's a little semblance there of the Confederate, of the palmetto tree and the flag of South Carolina. And in the next slide, I did not realize the number of stars in that, but I wanted to show a kind of transition, that the bloodiness now is dissipating, that the flag is there, but the flag does not have that kind of power because it doesn't have the same color. And again, you see peeping out from behind the church a kind of semblance of the South Carolina palmetto tree. And this work looks the way it looks because I did it on fabric that had a pattern on it. Somebody would say, boy, you took all that time to put all those patterns on it. And I couldn't lie. I said, no, I used a pattern fabric. But that fabric gave the surface a kind of mottled look. Next slide. And then I knew that I had to go to the church, that I couldn't continue painting without going to the church. And so my brother, who's back there, hooked me up with one of the trustees and deacons in the church. And they took me, both of us went down, and he took me on a tour of the church. But most importantly, what he did was took me down where they were having senior Bible study, a kind of class in the basement just inches away from where this all happened. It's all cleaned up now. But these were folks, and I sat down and talked with them. One of them reminded me so much of my mom. And so we chatted, and I had lunch with them, and I came away with a feeling that, they were going to be all right. But I needed to go into church. And when I went into church, I had been in there years earlier, but the outside of the church with that white, almost sterile color that dots the skyline in Charleston is nothing like the interior. The interior has warm wood, and you can tell it's aged, and it says something about the historical significance of the church. And I was really taken by that. And that is why you see that this particular one, the purples and all of that, it looks so different from the others, because I went inside and I looked at that window. Window looked like it's about 30 feet high. And I imagined that perhaps the soul of these folks rose up through that window, that this is where they worshiped every Sunday. But when they were killed, their souls rose up through that window. Next slide. And this one is, I came to a point where I just thought I should look back and see where we came from and kind of put it all together here. And so in this one, you see the crosses now going up to heaven. You see the target, you see the 9, and you see the flag that has lost its power. And so this is the point in that whole series that I was kind of taking stock of where to go next. And so the next slide is this one. And on this one, I knew I had a circle at the bottom and a circle at the top. But the circle at the bottom was what was the target, which is now lighting up. But the circle at the top had opened, and they were ascending to heaven. And before this, I had not used tape on my fabric. But you see, 3M invented something called frog tape. And you can put it down and dye wouldn't bleed through it. And so I made a nice line that separated the heavenly from the earthly. And you see them rising through that barrier upward. And then this slide. When you've done a series, and I worked on this series, started probably February, and it was exhibited at the church in June. And not at the church, at the gallery in Charleston in June. When you've worked on something that long, you try to find a way to end it. How do you end it? What do you say? Now, if you remember the Hallelujah Chorus, Handel's Hallelujah Chorus, after he wrote the Messiah, Hallelujah Chorus was the ending, and people stood up because it was so powerful. I don't write music, but I had to find a way to kind of put this together and to say, this is what it's all about. And then I remember in Charleston looking over the ocean and thought, this is where they came. And so at the top I have a horizon. And I could imagine Africans in the holds of slave ships coming to Charleston, being down there for a month, coming up on the deck and seeing a place they had never seen before. The sun isn't rising where it rose before. The place around it doesn't look like it looked before. And the sky itself is a kind of symbol of that uncertainty, because they didn't know that they were beginning their long and agonizing journey into slavery, into the night. And so I tried to put some semblance of what they left back home there. And that's why you see the kind of African symbols there. And it amazed me. I did not even realize it, that the spire of the church rose just above the horizon and you can see the cross. I don't know, I don't remember when I did that, it was just all coming out. And then the 9 is there, but more than anything else was James Weldon Johnson's poem and what has become known as the Negro National Anthem, the Black folks' national anthem. And if you have not read that or heard that, you really ought to. Because this line, I thought, summed up Mother Emanuel. We have come. And the emphasis on we have come, because I wanted it to be stated the same way that it's sung, the power of we have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come, treading a path through the blood of the slaughtered. I just thought that was what Mother Emanuel was all about. Now, people always ask the question, how did they arrive at that? What's amazing to me always is that if you remember, this was a Bible study. I go to senior Bible study on Wednesday. In fact, I would be in there tomorrow. And when you go into Bible study, you get up close and personal with the pastor. You don't see him up there. You see him down on your level. And you talk about things. And so there's a faith, a bond there. And amazingly, even in their darkest tragedy, they kept the faith of their Bible study. And you know, we African Americans don't think of this transition from life to death as painful. For us, it's homegoing ceremonies. We don't have funerals. We have homegoing ceremonies. The song says, everything will be better when we get home. No more pain, no more when we get home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. And so Mother Emanuel resulted in a homegoing, and the people who were left behind always felt that their friends and loved ones are just going home first, and they would be following them. That is perhaps why they said, I forgive. And it is a lesson that all of us, each of us, can learn. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll take a 10-minute intermission, and then we will start a conversation with 4 distinguished guests who are here today. If you have questions for Dr. Twiggs specifically about the paintings or his career, those might be best saved for the reception to follow the panel discussion. But right now, let's take 10 minutes and then come back and have a conversation. Thank you. On the topic of the massacre at Mother Emanuel, there's so much to say that it's hard to know where to begin and it's hard to know when to stop. But we're going to try to have a conversation today that discusses the connection between faith and art and community and race and healing. And toward that end, we have procured the services of the following distinguished panelists. In addition to Dr. Twiggs, to his immediate left, we have Reverend Eric Manning, now pastor, I've just lost your place on my sheet here, pastor at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, and the site, of course, of the 215 massacre. To his left, we have Michaela Pilar Brown, a well-traveled and decorated artist in various disciplines from Columbia, and a member of various boards, including One Columbia, the TAPS Art Center, and the Friends of African American Art and Culture at the Columbia Museum of Art. Next is Darion McCloud, founder of the NIA Theater Company and of Story Squad, an ensemble of storytellers, musicians, and singers very popular in and around Columbia. Also a Riley Institute Diversity Fellow, an Indie Grips Lab Fellow, and coincidentally, a Leo Twiggs Scholar. And on his left is Reverend Merritt Graves, pastor at Mount Zion AME Church and chaplain at Francis Marion University. And I'd like to begin the panel discussion by asking each of you panelists to please identify and expand on something that Dr. Twiggs mentioned or raised in you that you would like to discuss. Starting with you, Reverend Manning.
Well, thank you again for having me to be a part of this wonderful discussion this afternoon. When I was listening to Dr. Twiggs, there was one aspect, of course, that I think a lot of us kind of talk about and maybe wrestle with, which, of course, stems immediately from the tragedy, dealing with forgiveness. How could the families start to forgive immediately after such a horrific event? And that's something where a lot of people throughout this entire country, and dare I say the world, continue to struggle with. And when they come to Mother Emanuel, that question is one that I always continue to have to field. And I always come down on the side of Scripture. I tell folks wherever I go that I'm a pastor, so I have a biblical worldview. My biblical worldview gives me the ability to forgive against a lot of times some of the most egregious atrocities that have taken place. Forgiveness is one that I've shared with many folks, that it's not necessarily a sprint, but it's a marathon. It means that you are going to have to continuously work at it. You're going to have to continuously forgive folks for what they have done. So when you think about the bail bonds and the hearing that was taking place when Dylan Roof was there and the families began to speak, one with another. First, Nadine spoke. Nadine is the daughter of Ethel Lance. She spoke and said, "It hurts me. You took someone I love away from me. I forgive you." I spoke with Nadine, and she said she didn't plan on saying that, but it just felt that that's what needed to be said. Reverend Anthony Thompson, the husband of Myra Thompson, came right after and said, "You need to repent. We forgive you." Now, a dear friend of mine as well, we sat down on numerous occasions and we talked about that, and he said, he didn't plan on saying anything either. But the Holy Spirit ministered to him and instructed him to say these words. And after he did, there was such a release that took place. Bottled up, of course, anger, hostility was gone, and it was replaced with the love and the peace that surpasses all understanding. And I think a lot of times people ask the questions, well, how in the world can we forgive? Well, we have a wonderful model that's recorded in scriptures where Jesus, of course, on the cross said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And in that process, it gives us something to kind of lay hold to. From an African-American perspective, we have had to do a lot of forgiving. We have had to always turn the other cheek. And if you heard as well early on, that's something that is within us. But there's also a greater authority, there's also a greater power that allows for us to forgive. And I think realistically that when we begin to talk about racial reconciliation and we begin to try to move the needle forward and try to push the ball further down the field, we have to forgive for all of the atrocities that have taken place. Even if you begin to think about the whole plight of slavery in that regard, and you begin to think about how Africans, how blacks were packaged like sardines, and you begin to think about bodily fluids flowing one on top of another. And it did not kill the race, but instead it, of course, gave us this inherent form of resilience. But even with all of those atrocities and dealing with the various aspects of slavery and everything that has taken place, even still to this day, it's the power of forgiveness. And I think, like I said before, in my ways of kind of introducing the whole thought process there, forgiveness is something that we must begin to embrace. Now, as I share with others, it's not a cheap form of forgiveness. It's not a cheap form of grace. It's basically saying we're going to have to be vested in the process of forgiving one another. And as we begin to forgive one another, then we have a process of repentance that has to take place. Then when we continue to repent and we have the reconciliation, then of course we have the love that continues to bind us all together. But I think realistically what I heard was dealing with forgiveness, and Dr. Twiggs is absolutely correct. A lot of folks wrestle with that. And that's a question that people want to know. How can you do it? Well, again, if you understand from a Christian perspective that we have been forgiven, then we have an obligation to extend that same level of forgiveness to others. And that's exactly what the families of the Emanuel 9 did. And that continues to resonate throughout not only this state, not only throughout this country, but throughout the entire world, because we still have people from all over the world coming and visiting with us on a regular basis. And it is our sincere prayer that we as a collective body will continue to embrace that whole aspect of forgiveness, so that way we could pass it on down to the next generation and prayerfully leave this world in a better place in which we have all found it.
And now in any order.
As a visual artist, I was caught by the struggle of representation, and often battle with the idea of symbols and what they mean in the work and what they translate to an audience, determining who your audience will be and what symbols will work to communicate the ideas that you want, and how differently we look at those symbols. What the Confederate flag means for Black Americans as opposed to what it means to Southern white Americans, and what it means to Northern white Americans, and how those symbols, seen very differently from very different audiences, can communicate different ideas. And understanding what that struggle is and looking at the beauty of what he created at the tail end of that struggle. Determining what it is that you will make, how you will make it, and what will happen after the work enters the world, and what kind of conversations will be had around that work. Representation still matters for Black Americans. It's why Black Panther is selling out crowds, because it's still very important that we see ourselves in a beautiful light, that we are represented in the world. We have historically created images of ourselves that would change the narrative, that would regain and control the narrative of who we are and how we're seen in the world. So it was just interesting to listen to Dr. Twiggs talk about his choice of symbols and how those symbols were transformed over decades in the work, and how they came to be used as tools to communicate this great tragedy.
I'm going to piggyback on what both of you guys have said to a point. For me, a lot of what jumped out was the storytelling, the narrative. The narrative storytelling is a mechanism that we use to understand things. That's what religion springs from, is what mythology springs from. You talked about the Black Panther, those are stories. All of these, Dr. Twiggs in his own way was approaching, trying to make sense of this story of slaughter, which is, unfortunately, it's a historical story. I see the struggle for forgiveness also as stories. This collection of biblical stories that lead us to a point that justifies the action of forgiveness. But there are tons of stories. There's different ways. And also it makes me wonder if the stories that we as a people, by we as a people I mean specifically Americans, specifically Southern African Americans right now, I'm speaking, well, no, to everybody actually. The stories that we've been fed, the stories that we've digested, the stories that we create. Sometimes to me, it feels almost like we don't have an option. Like forgiveness was already predestined. Like anything short of forgiveness is failure. And that may or may not be, but to speak to your point, it is a process, it is a marathon. And I think also, if you have forgiveness, there is also the option of not forgiving. That's just the truth of the situation. But I wonder how much the stories that we tell each other, the stories that we've heard about ourselves, factor into that decision making.
I think the thing that Dr. Twiggs spoke about that touched my spirit was when he said we have to change the way we look at things. And changing the way we look at things also means we sometimes have to change the way we look at ourselves. I'm a believer that God does everything for a reason. Do I know the reason? Not necessarily. But I trust God to know that he knows exactly what he's doing. And so do we look at the Emanuel 9, as tragic as it was, do we look at them as martyrs, those 9 people that died? And then I ask you, would we be having this conversation had it not been for the tragedy? Would we be having this forum? I don't know if that's God's way of making us come to the table and talk about the things that plague us as a country. But I do know that it's time for the conversation. And so we've got to change the way we look at things that occur in our lives. And I think if we look at it from a different way, we can come up with a different outcome. As we talk about healing, I have some scars from racism that I'm dealing with. And so I have to change the way that I look at those incidents if I'm going to move beyond them. And I think I can move beyond them because of my faith. The faith that these families had is what enabled them to move beyond and to say, I forgive. And I think that as we move forward, each of us needs to look at ourselves and remember what Jesus said when he said, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, that you love one another.
I wonder what happens if we take this conversation out of a religious context and we speak less about forgiveness and talk more about atonement and speak less about grace and more about policy. I think often African Americans are the only people expected to offer forgiveness without anything in return.
I think that also goes back to the stories that we've ingested. We literally, by we I mean African Americans, I mean black people, we feel it's our destiny. It's our destiny to do just that. That forgiveness is almost a genetic gift that we have. And that's a great thing. That is a great thing to forgive, because when you forgive, you also release yourself from those chains. But on the flip side of that, like I said, the stories that we're told, almost like every story has to end in forgiveness. Every black mother I see on television has to forgive the people, the man who's killed her son or her child or her daughter or whoever. And I'm like, do we have to forgive all? To Michaela's point, what's the price? You know, we've told ourselves these stories, and sometimes it comes from, just to be totally honest, coming from a place of powerlessness, of having no alternatives. You have to make sense of the senseless, and part of that is forgiveness. But maybe not so. Also, part of our story is, part of black people's story is being amongst the powerless and somehow finding power, rising up, demanding. No one gave us our rights, we took our rights. Those rights are paved in blood, lives. Unfortunately, people are still paying the price now. But that's a story I feel like, once again, back to the story, back to the narrative. That's a story that we don't tell. Even the way we've referenced the situation. Because that's actually, for me at least, the entire truth. The whole story. And then you approach it from, to your point, you approach it from a kind of different perspective. When I see the complete image or to hear the complete story, then with that, all that information allows me to make a decision based on more, not less.
Once again, since I'm a pastor and I have the opportunity to have a biblical worldview on this particular perspective, I hear both of your comments, and I understand where you're coming from in that particular perspective. However, one thing that I have shared with so many folks is that what makes this different, what makes the murders that took place at Mother Emanuel different, what drew the world together, what continues to allow, as Reverend Graves has already said, for this discussion to be almost 3 years afterwards. Now, granted, we're still having the discussion. We haven't necessarily moved the needle forward as we have wanted to. But it's dealing with forgiveness. It's not necessarily a story. It's a reality. Because day after day, as I share with many other folks, I walk into a murder scene. I live it. Day after day, we get still the phone calls that talk about target practice. I live it. Day after day, I still get emails that talked about where they want to place another Confederate flag. I live it. And I have two choices. I think you said we have a choice to forgive or not to forgive, and I live in that world where I have to forgive, where I have to love my enemy, whoever that enemy may be, as I love my neighbor. And I think realistically, when we have embraced the whole ministry, if you will, if I can use that term, of forgiveness, it's not necessarily, as some have questioned my thought process with forgiveness. It's not a weak form, and it's not up for debate. But it's one of those that you have to begin to embrace and say, at my core, this is what I choose to do. There can be countless studies that we could cite that would say people that carry animosity or hate within themselves for several years, it becomes cancerous and it begins to tear away at the very fabric of a community. But there can be a forgiveness part that says, you know what, I'm going to forgive. Now, I'm not necessarily going to just excuse. And that's one thing I want people to understand. This is not to say that we are forgiving and then moving on. No. We have to then begin to speak truth to power. We have to begin to do the hard work about looking at the legislative policies that are continuing to be passed, the gun reforms that have not taken place. Those are the things that we have to continue to push to ensure that we have a better society. Gun violence is gun violence. What took place a couple weeks ago in Parkland, Florida, is unacceptable. But at the same token, even if you go back to what took place in Kentucky, one of the 15-year-olds quickly pivoted on that following morning and said, you know what, we still have to forgive that shooter. And I listened to CBS this morning, and I listened to Gayle King, and she said, you know, it always amazes me how people are able to pivot so quickly to say they forgive. They can forgive because they understood or understand that they have been forgiven. And I understand that realistically it challenges us sometimes to get to a place where we may not feel as comfortable because we may not feel exactly where we should feel with our with the whole aspect of Christianity and where that may lead us. But I think at the end of the day, as I have reflected upon this for a growing period of time, it's the ministry of forgiveness that helps us all. But like I said before, it's not easy, especially when you still think about all the other atrocities that are taking place. It's not easy. It's not easy that I had to forgive a nice officer who pulled me over. I'm driving down Calhoun Street, and he pulls me over, and he didn't recognize who I was. I gave him my card. Next thing you know, he had this red look on his face. He pulled me over because I was a black man driving a car. It's there. It's real. We live it. From African American community perspective, we live it daily, sometimes even hourly. But the question that we must ask ourselves is, are we going to continue to allow it to destroy us, or are we going to actually take the higher road to forgive, but then again to work together to impact and enforce policy changes, which my sister made as well, I think is important, because we have to begin to change policies. If we do not, then those 9 lives, in my humble opinion, would be lost in vain. So we have to do something.
I think we need to first understand that my talking about forgiveness does not mean that I believe everyone has the ability to forgive, because we're not a society full of folk who can forgive folk for the kind of action that Dylan Roof committed. Many of us. And the other thing, forgiveness does not mean that we call for inaction. It doesn't mean that we stop trying to combat what's going on. It doesn't mean we stop trying to change the world. I can forgive you and still not like what you've done to me. I can forgive you and still move on at trying to do some things to change what's going on in the world.
I guess my concern is that in the talk of grace and forgiveness, we have some missed opportunities. I think that anger is a righteous emotion as well. And I think that anger can propel a community forward. And collective anger, you know, as seen with these teenagers who are tired of the violence, collective anger can push for change. What I'm concerned with is that in all of this talk of forgiveness and grace, we reach a soft and comfortable place that doesn't allow us to feel the discomfort that we need to feel to push for real change.
I think maybe even a place of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a bad word. And first I want to go back to and make sure that we understand not to dismiss the power of story. Stories are who we are. Stories are how you tell your children and your grandchildren and the ones who come after you, after them, who you are. You mentioned the Black Panther. That's a story. That story is all particular power for so many different reasons. I'm a professional storyteller. I tell one story that's over 400 years old. That's power. Something that can last that long, that is powerful. It informs everyone sitting in this room right now, everyone under my voice has been informed by the story of who they are, but also informed by the story of who they are not, of who the world tries to tell you who you are not. That is a reality. Understand that. You are informed by the story the world tells you, but also the story the world chooses not to tell you, or tell you opposing to who you even think you are. So one of the things I want to say to that point is, I think a lot of times in these situations, forgiveness, sometimes we pivot on forgiveness so quickly, it almost seems that we sacrifice the rest of the story. We're supposed to be angry. We're supposed to be hurt. When your loved one gets killed, you talked about the story of being pulled over. I have way too many of those stories. I have a story, when you got time, I tell the story about me fighting 7 cops one night for walking through 200 yards away from my front door. That's reality. That's reality. But we are human beings. That's really what we all are. When we talk about, we all are human beings. Dylan Roof is a human being. The 9 were human beings. Dr. Twiggs. And this art, this storytelling, this visual art is all about us trying to land on a place together as humans. And sometimes, this is my own personal feeling. These are my own personal feelings. Sometimes I feel like we give up the rest of our humanity to make sure that we can forgive, that we can all work together. We can work together, but I need to be angry. I need to be hurt. I'm angry. I'm hurt. That is also part of the real story of me or my friends or whatever we're going through. And I see now it's become almost, it's spectacle. I'm talking about the media now. I'm talking about something different. I see people being hurt, being gunned, being mowed down, and within days, first it's the spectacle of the weeping, and then people feel almost obligated, I feel like, or we feel an obligation towards them that they have to forgive. You know, that's, humanity dictates that sometimes you struggle, to your point, we struggle for a long time. I'm going to shut up because you got something to say.
Question, and I appreciate the power of forgiveness, but I think you're all been very clear that that does not mean forgetting. And I would also appreciate it if each one of the panelists could specify a particular concrete piece of policy legislation that you feel would advance this conversation beyond grace, beyond pivoting, beyond... seems to me if we're going to have a conversation, then we need to have a conversation about something concrete and specific that could be done that would make this situation even a little bit better. Thank you.
I'm not a politician. I'm not a legislator. I can't give you a specific policy. I am a gun owner from a long tradition of people who own guns, but I believe in gun control. I believe that we have to start making some smart decisions about who gets guns, where they go, how many guns, what kind of guns. I don't think we need war machines on the streets.
If we're talking about the Emanuel 9 situation, legislation can't change your heart. Legislation does not change racism. Legislation does not stop hatred. I firmly believe that prejudice and racism is not innate, it is taught. I grew up in the 60s. I was one of a few blacks in 1967 prior to integration being mandated who attended predominantly white schools. For the majority of my life, I've attended predominantly white schools. But I was raised in a house where I was not taught racism. And so we can legislate all day long. And the other part about it is, as a former law enforcement officer, you can't stop criminals from getting weapons. So we can't legislate everything. Some things have to start at home. Some things have to start in our schools and in our churches. We can go to Washington and pass every law we want to pass. That alone will not change where we are.
Well, to your question, it's a pretty broad question, but I can tell you one of the things that I believe. I believe our educational system, you spoke to the schools. I believe that we are mandated by law to send our children to school. We have to send, we send thousands of children, millions of children across the country every day to school. And schools are just as segregated now as they ever were. I was bused to school. I was bused to an all-black school. You know, and at first this approach about race, if we approach schooling through classal, if we had schools where middle-class kids went along with poor kids, went along with black kids, a lot of the integration that we were seeking, the desegregation that we were seeking, I think would occur. But also when we get children in these places, that we give them, I spoke to the whole story, the whole truth. Black History Month is a good example. We got Women's History Month coming out. We got Native American History Month coming out. The commonality is they're all history. They're all history. If we could start teaching, I'm starting with the kids because that's one thing I think everybody, well, I'm starting there. It's not only with the children, it's with all of us also. But if we can make our school systems more representative of the people that populate this country. And I don't mean handing over, I mean just actually telling the real stories, at least learning the real lessons, teaching the real lessons. And I can say this, I'm in the school, I can be in 3 or 4 schools in one week. It's nothing for me literally to go to one school where kids are as privileged as they can be, and then the very next day be in a school where every classroom has a leaking ceiling. The disparity between resources, the disparity between teachers, the disparity, I don't even start on what teachers get paid and all that good stuff. But our educational system is a place we all have to pass through. We all have to pass through it. And it is a great place to do good work. I'm not saying that there's not good work being done now, but I think we could all agree, to your point, there's more to be done. There's more to be done. So I think everything from beginning from teacher pay to how we approach how schools are populated, where schools are placed, what schools offer, all that's, and that's only one, but that's the one I can give to you right now.
And I agree that segregation still exists. In Florence, in this current school system, my son graduated from one of the high schools in town, and he went through his entire high school career not having one teacher teach him a core class. I mean, the major stuff, the English, the biology, the maths. Not one class was taught to him throughout that career by somebody that looked like him. And don't tell me that Florence District 1 does not have enough teachers of all colors that you can put somebody everywhere.
I guess realistically, to hearing what everyone was saying, to piggyback on what Reverend Green said quickly, we cannot legislate matters of the heart. Love is something that of course has to be taught first, of course, within the home. You think about self-radicalization that takes place, and there are countless examples of that. So it becomes rather challenging. But at the same token, several of the policies that are continuously being passed on a regular basis within the state as well as within the country begin to have those undertones of racism. Very simple, and a lot of times people don't even think about it, but even with the most recent tax law that was passed, there is one part that talks about the funds that used to be set aside for college. I think it's a 529. Now you can actually use those for homeschooling. And if you begin to think about which demographic is usually homeschooled, majority of the times it is white children that are homeschooled. So you see that mass exodus once again, even from the public school perspective. Several years ago, it was the charter initiative and how all the charter schools started. Charter was another way, again, of bringing, taking diversity, taking white children out of public schools and almost turning their backs on black children who were in the school system. So you begin to think about and look at all of these other laws that begin to get passed, and you have to look at it from other people's perspective. You have to look at it and say, is this going to realistically improve the entire community? Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, etc. Or is it just going to make one group, or is it really just going to benefit one person, or one group, or one race, or one gender? And when you begin to do that, then you can begin to understand the legislation that's continues to be passed and enacted, and how it actually takes away further and from the black community, and of course gives more credence, if you will, to the white population. This past weekend, there was an episode or HBO film called Notes from the Field, and I don't know if anyone had an opportunity to watch that, but it talks about the racial activities that take place. It talks about how the prison system is formed and how it automatically begins to be set up, not necessarily for whites, but for blacks. And you begin to think about all of the other atrocities that take place in our schools. My wife is a teacher. We have this discussion daily on all the atrocities that are taking place within the school system. And I think realistically what we have to begin to do to answer your immediate question is to pay very close attention to what laws are currently being passed and ask ourselves the question, are they benefiting one group of people, or are they looking to harm another group? We think about the Affordable Health Care Act. We think about how the Medicare expansion, all these other things that are coming down the pipe that we look at and we say, well, yeah, they're benefiting one group of people, and if they are, then we realistically need to educate ourselves on the policy, understand what's being said, what's being done, and then begin to speak out against that. But what we find, even as I was in Columbia earlier today, talking about another gun reform bill, or I guess the first one is probably trying to come out of the Senate, is we have a demographic, we have a lot of folks who just don't know. And what they begin to do is they look for the lightning rod. They look for the quick thing that they can attack, and they attack it, and then when it falls out of the media cycle, it goes in the back burner. And realistically, as a country, we have done that far too frequently. We have not talked about policy. We have not talked about how the judges are for the Supreme Court and how they continue to dismantle the Voting Rights Act. You begin to look at all of these other things, and you have to come to the quick conclusion that there is, of course, a systemic beneficiary from these laws that are being impacted. So, you know, with all of that I've said, there are so many things that are there, but again, I think realistically, if I leave you with 2 quick points, one is to make sure that you know the policies that are coming down, and then begin to look at them from the lens of your neighbor, whomever that neighbor may be. And then secondly is, if it is not a policy or a law that helps the entire community, whomever, again, who's made up of that community, then you need to speak out to that and say, this is a policy that we don't necessarily need right now. It's not going to do anything to bring the country together. It's going to continue to divide us. And realistically, that's what is happening. You know, we're continuing to be divided, and we have to look for things that can actually draw us all together.
I'm trying to be quick. Real quick, I want to say something. We cannot legislate your heart. Legislation cannot make you love someone. But a core American value is fairness. That's what legislation is for. Whatever isms on my trip, sexism, racism, ageism, whatever ism, classism, that should not be your trip. So when we interact, and if I'm a person in power, an employer, or whatever, legislation is in place to protect you against my particular shortcomings, my failings. We cannot, the heart, that's left up to us. That's the hard work. But policy is to promote fairness and protect each other, to protect us from each other's shortcomings.
We have some more questions from the floor. Over here, Lahim.
I remember a long time ago, someone did something to me, and I thought that I would hate them for the rest of my life. Then one day I was sitting down thinking about it. I couldn't even remember the person's name. That let me know that I had forgiven them. Also, we've all had things done to us. In the past, we've been killed, we've been beaten, we've been enslaved, we've been discriminated against. But across God's entire creation, the same thing is also happening to other races. If you watched the news yesterday and you saw all those children and adults that were killed with, what was it, acid that they sprayed? Syria. So it's up to us to get to know each other and to love each other. If I sit down and talk to someone long enough, I'll see that their heart is basically the same as mine, that we want the same things out of life. We want to be happy, we want to be peaceful, we want someone to care about us. But we don't take the time to know people. We don't take the time to look into their hearts and to read this and to look into their souls. Because there's no one, I figured out that day when I couldn't even remember the person's name, and I started thinking, who do I hate? And that's when I realized that I don't hate anyone. It's not worth the effort.
One thing that I will share with you is a couple weeks ago when I was in Rome, Georgia, and this is possibly maybe something that could, a template that could be deployed in other venues, is what they actually did was they formulated small groups to do exactly what you said, to get to know each other, to have discussions, because a lot of times we do not have those discussions with each other. We don't actually sit down and talk with anyone. We find it's easier to talk at people as opposed to sit down and really talk to them, learn their story, learn who they are, learn their struggles. You'll find out that you both have the same struggles. You'll find out that you have the same goals. And then you'll realize that there's more that draws you together than that separates you. And then when you have those discussions within your community, then as they are doing in Rome, Georgia, then those groups come back together again and they talk about policy, they talk about legislation, they talk about how we can make a difference for our community. Rome, Georgia, and it tickled me, not to digress for a moment, but that is, of course, the home, the birthplace, if you will, of the person who founded the Ku Klux Klan. And before all of the monument work started, they, from a community perspective, said, we don't want him anymore downtown Rome. We want to move him out of the city limits. I joked about where they moved him to, but they moved him to a cemetery. And of course, the cemetery sits on a hill, but we're not going to get involved with all of that. But it was a template that I started to really look at and begin to think that maybe realistically what we should do from a community perspective, and we're trying to do the same thing in Charleston, is to start with those small groups, get to know each other. Because what begins to happen when you look out for your neighbor, whomever that neighbor may be, then you begin to understand that you two are alike. And that there's more that can draw you closer than it will divide you. And hopefully, maybe, you know, that template will continue to resonate within various other communities. And then the communities can continue to grow stronger with each other. That's just one thought process to, I think, your question where you were kind of going with working together and getting to know each other. And we find that sometimes even small groups, I joked and said we could take our discussion to Starbucks because we got a nice little small group here. And I think that would probably help us all learn a little bit more about each other. But that's just a suggestion.
Reverend Manning, and the group, as we proceed through the current political climate, do you think we're moving closer to what you've just described or further from it?
Tell the truth.
Yeah, well, going back to the whole aspect of anger, no, we're not. We're actually going further away from it. And I joke about whenever I speak in public situations that it irritates me to no belief how we have number 45 who gets up and tweets every morning about division and never really looking at how to unite a country. And it's sad, right? Because realistically, as I said before in other discussions, that leadership is everything, and we need solid leadership. We need people who are going to say, you know what, we may be liberal or conservative, Democrat, Republican, but at the end of the day, when I wake up in the morning, I breathe the same air that God has given me. I still live a life that God has given me. And when you begin to understand that all of us are on an equal playing field wherever, if you're a believer or not a believer, whatever the case may be, when you begin to understand that we're all here to do a work or to do a job that only that one person can do, then once again, you realize that you have to work together. And I think realistically, we're not working together anymore. We no longer are talking to each other, we talk at each other. We no longer exchange ideas in a comfortable platform that help each other understand where the other person is coming from. We use that word empathy. We just basically yell. We have to learn how to, and remember how to talk to each other. Because when we learn and we remember how to talk to each other, then we can definitely do a little bit more in bringing the communities together.
but we cannot wait for our leaders, such as 45, to bring us together. These conversations have to start in our own communities right where we are. And when we have these conversations, we can begin to deal with that. But as a church leader, as a pastor, we've got to be realistic. The most segregated hour in America is 10, 11 o'clock on Sunday morning.
And policy can't change hearts, but it can set culture. Culture in this country is shifted and guided by the policies that govern us. I am the last of 5 children, and I'm the only one of my siblings who never went to a segregated school. And the differences in our attitudes, the differences in the way we approach the world are framed by that one experience. So children sitting beside each other in class determines how they will feel about each other in the future. And that's policy. Communities where your neighbor does not necessarily look just like you will help you understand a community that does not look just like yours. And that's policy. So we can't legislate hearts, but we can help to shift the culture by who we elect, particularly closest to home. That's where you have the most impact. Who you elect and what laws you encourage them to pass.
We have a question over here, please. Over here. There you go. There you go.
I'd first like to direct this question to Dr. Twiggs. I was looking at the imagery of your art, and some of the symbolisms really stuck out to me. The target, the flag, particularly the faded flag. And to form my question, first I would say I personally don't feel like a target. And myself, I never felt personally any power of the Confederate flag symbol over me and what I do. But the image in the art that struck me the most was the figure being targeted, that elusive shadow that comes in and out. Because of all the things, I think I most feel invisible, as if what I truly am is not seen. No matter how hard I work in the communities that I'm in to do the best of my abilities, it often seems like I'm just a shadow and potentially a target for something that can't comprehend me or something that can be covered by an old symbol. So my question may still seem vague, because we speak about many, many different things and many, many subjects from one end to the other. But I'm often in search of what we are trying to converse about. What is the conversation that I need to have? If I'm speaking to someone from another culture, what is it that I'm trying to get them to understand? And more importantly, if I'm speaking to young black men or young white men, what is it that I want to say? Out of all the things that are happening, there's a lot of circular talk that creates ineffective aspects. I'm still invisible and potentially still a target and potentially still covered by old symbolisms. What is the conversation that we have to hone in on that allows us to push past this, and if nothing else, allow me to become a solidified figure of what I really am?
You know,
I think you're on.
Visual symbols are powerful. And I'm very pleased that you got something out of that. I wanted to show that because there's no real answer that you could give, concrete answer. That's why when you see those figures emerging out of that darkness, is it friend or foe? What is happening in that target? Is the person that you're looking at being targeted, or is that person targeting somebody else? And I think art is supposed to create questions. Baldwin said the purpose of art is to create that question about existence. And so, as an artist, what I try to do is to make you think about what you're looking at and go back into your experience and connect with it. I don't have answers about that. I only create questions about that. And I hope that these questions will help you seek answers.
I like to offer that. I understand your point, I hear what you're saying, but I believe that you're more than a silhouette. I believe that you're a target because folks see who you are. They see your potential. They see our resilience. Black folks should not still be here after all we've gone through. But look at us. Look at you. Because of what? Because of the possibilities and your potential, I believe that's why the target is there. So I don't think people don't see you for who you are and what you are. I think sometimes you become a threat because of who you are and what you are.
Please.
Go ahead.
I'd like to extend it to the panel. Does anyone else want to?
Real quick, you're human. That's, for me in my art, I am a black, 54-year-old male human. And I know that might sound trite, might sound cliche, but that's really what in my art, that's what I'm really trying to get to. I'm lucky enough, a lot of times when I'm working, when I'm performing, I have some really diverse audiences. I was telling Michaela the other day, I was recalling a show where it was everybody literally from homeless people to politicians and their kids to theater geeks to people who just stumbled into the show. But what I believe, again, this is my personal belief, is art is the exploration and the study of humanity, who we are, who we really are. And all that other stuff is great. It's not to be thrown away. There's nothing wrong with being gay, lesbian, I don't know, I can't even, whatever combination, it doesn't matter. That just makes that even better. But at the core, we're human. That's how you get to, you guys, the potential for forgiveness. What's more human than that? You know, for me, it sounds trite, but it's not. I fight for this all the time. Humanity, the exploration of humanity. And that means a lot of different things for a lot of, when you get down to it, because you got to drill down. You got to drill down. Because the world keeps telling you this, or you're not this. We're human. No matter what, you are human.
There have been some interesting discussions recently because of the kind of power that the young people in Parkland have gathered and the kind of visibility that they've been given. When the children of the Black Lives Matter movement did not receive the same kind of coverage or compassion or empathy. So there are real questions about who's visible and who's not, and what that visibility does to change the world moving forward. So whose voices are heard, whose voices are silenced, whose art is given opportunity to be seen. I don't have an answer for you other than, I don't know what you do, but you keep doing what you do. And you refuse to be silenced. And you keep making space for other voices as well. I think it's really important that we make room, that we hold space for others, people who are voiceless or who are challenged to have their ideas heard. I think that's where it starts, that we aren't thinking solely about our own visibility, but if we think about our community as a whole and what visibility does and how it moves us forward.
Over here, please.
First of all, I'm 19. I'm just a kid myself, but I was sitting with my best friend here today, and I heard what Reverend Graves was mentioning, how black African Americans, we are targets. But I stand here to say history is repeating itself, yes, but at the same time, things could be a lot better. They're better than what they were back in the past. But as Reverend Graves said, black people are a target. We are. But I stand here to say I find that very hard to believe, because my best friend who is here with me today is white. And he could be a target himself too. Because at the end of the day, racism is something that is taught and embedded into the mind because of the person who has taught it. Love is taught. So when you say that black people are a target, are you really taking consideration, sir, that anyone could be a target, no matter what race, who you are? Because as I said, I'm here with my best friend. He could be a target of a black person, a racist black person. I could be a target of a racist white person, but he could actually be the target of a racist black person. So my thing is, aren't we all targets of racism? Am I right?
Not all racism.
Well, not even just racism. Well, let me rephrase that. Not even just racism, but more of the stereotypical aspects of things. Like, for example, all black people eat fried chicken. That is false. That is like me saying...
Fried chicken is delicious. Don't hate on fried chicken. That is racist. Because everybody likes fried chicken because it's good.
But as I was saying, from stereotypical aspects, as I was saying, how one general stereotypical thing, all black people like fried chicken, which is false, because some might like their chicken baked. And all white people have red hair. First of all, I only know one girl who is also another one of my friends. She has red hair. That's the only girl I know that has red hair. So that's another stereotypical aspect that does not even need to be called out.
I think you are the product of progress, because you don't even recognize the dangers that are there. I think we have to talk about it realistically and honestly, and certainly things are better for you than they were for your grandfather. But we have to talk about what privilege is. So your white friend probably has lots of things that make him victim, make him possible target, but the targets for you are different.
Yes,
and the targets for you are legislated into law.
Well, that is true too.
There are dangers that are out there for you that aren't out there for him, that are protected by the law. And those are the kinds of changes that we're talking about.
Yes, of course. But I guess because I grew up learning how to love and how to forgive, that I can't really see just us being targeted. I can see other races being targeted and everything, but looking back at our history, how African Americans have come over to the Americas, and how we have been enslaved over years and hundreds of years, and we finally, we break free. But at the same time, whites have been enslaved as well too. Asians have been enslaved. Everyone has been enslaved. I guess what I'm trying to say is no one is better than anyone. I don't care who you are.
We aren't better, but our experiences are different.
Exactly.
And our experiences inform who we are and how we move forward in the world.
Right.
And slavery under the American system is different than slavery in a lot of other places. Mm-hmm. And to move forward, we have to have an honest conversation. Yes. About what's happened to us.
You're right. We have to be able to express it openly, and like Mr. McCloud was saying.
And an informed conversation.
And like Mr. McCloud saying, telling stories and giving different perspectives, we have to look at it from every different perspective as well too. We can't just look at it one, we have to look at it all.
On that note, we have one more question over here. We have another perspective here.
If I can,
go ahead.
A moment.
Go ahead.
I think realistically what you are articulating is your worldview. And I think, I can speak from experience, because I grew up in Pennsylvania. I went to an all-white high school. Mm-hmm. The godparents of my daughter, my firstborn child, are white. They're my best friends. We would exchange and we would share. Now, here's the difference. when we would go into a restaurant, they may be seated if I wasn't with them. That's the reality of the situation.
Sure.
My worldview was one of growing up with looking at people not based upon their ethnicity,
But
their,
more
their
of their
gender, but
personality
just
and
who
who
they
they
are.
are.
But the reality of the situation is, whenever we go to another place, I will always be looked at as a black male. And that is something that I think realistically we have to begin to help other people understand, that we are all human beings. One of the examples I use is that if you cut me, I bleed. We bleed the same blood, white, black, whatever the case may be. And I think realistically, you are growing up in that era where there are still, unfortunately, as Ms. Brown was saying, there is still the legislative aspects that have been done that will still do you more harm. And that's why it's very important for all of your age group to be informed on the various laws that are being passed and the things that are done, and then have the courage to undo those wrongs. Because I think realistically, as your generation continues to grow and comes into power, there can be a lot of things, a lot of rights, a lot of wrongs that can be made right. All right?
Thank you.
Can I say something super quick, John?
Sure.
Just super quick.
Of course.
Bruh, what's your name? Bruh, what's your name? Tyrese? Tyrese, what you're doing now is it's a micro thing. There's, isms are large, and then we got our own personal interactions. But what you're doing is beautiful, man. You're going through the world. The world is the world, but it's your life. And you're figuring it out as you go along. And everybody in this room is figuring it out, bro. Thank you. That's beautiful, man. That's beautiful. Keep figuring it out. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. But just
it doesn't
keep figuring
really
it out.
matter, because at the end of the day, as all of you stated on the panel, racism is something that is taught. It is not, racism is something that is taught, but it can also be untaught.
But just remember, you are human.
Everybody's human, not just me, not just you. Everyone is human.
Everybody is human. You have the capacity for love in you that is beyond. I can't even. I got shut up because I told John I was going to be short. But keep doing it, bro. Keep fighting the fight. Keep trying to be human. Keep trying to be human.
We have time for one more question. Kenneth Green.
Hi, how you doing? I'm Jonathan Green, Jr. I'm a graduating senior here at Francis Marion. And I have a couple numbers here, and they may be off, but the numbers I have, if we have 236 years of slavery, and then 90 years of institutionalized oppression through Jim Crow and segregation. And what that speaks to me is, it speaks not only of the resiliency of our race, but also feel like until we can deal with what has happened, we are a broken people. And I feel like realistically, change is going to come, but I kind of sort of have to be optimistic because I'm turning 22 and I got a life ahead of me, so I can't grow and live and be sad. So the crux of my question is, I feel like this conversation is good because we get to the point where we're starting to start the understanding piece. How do we go from a point of understanding to a point of healing?
I'm not sure we're a broken people. I think the system, I'm not sure we're broken people. I think the system we live in is broken. I think that I think we are, as humans, always struggling and recovering from the different things that happen to us. But I think the fact that we've made it this far, speaks to how unbroken we are. How they were unable to break us. And I think that you can find that healing in art and in stories and in community and in people. You can find your way, and you can find your way to other people.
Ministry.
And the ministry.
You may certainly have the last word, except I'm going to after you go.
This all began with my presentation about Mother Emanuel.
I'd like to pose a question to you. Since you're asking questions, let me ask. What happened after Mother Emanuel? The last thing I said in the video was, this was our finest moment. The flag came down. The finest moment in our state. Do you think that if Mother Emanuel happened today, what kind of response would we have? Would the flag come down?
Wow.
Would the governor come and say, we have to remove it?
Wow.
Would one legislature make an impassioned speech on the floor to say that 9 lives are lost, we've got to do something? What do you think would happen today?
That's a drop of the mic.
Yeah.
And that was worth a round of applause. Just a reminder before we go out and have some food and beverage out there, and certainly talk with our panelists and Dr. Twiggs. Tomorrow, again, to remind you, Dr. Cleveland Sellers will be speaking on the topic of education, race, and culture, and the word education keeps coming up in all of these conversations. A story was told about Dr. Sellers yesterday that I want to ask him about tomorrow. He survived the Orangeburg massacre, got shot, got arrested, got released. Before he got arrested, a tank pulled up at his front door and aimed the cannon at it, and they said, "Come out," and he did. And I want to hear more about that, and I urge you to come out and hear him speak. He went on, of course, to become the president of Voorhees College. He's being joined by journalist Herb Fraser from Charleston, who is one of the authors of the book We Are Charleston, which is on sale out in the lobby, as is Dr. Twiggs' book Messages from Home. Also joining Herb Fraser tomorrow is Dr. Valinda Littlefield, Director of African American Studies at the University of South Carolina, and the Honorable Joe Riley, former mayor of Charleston and also mayor when the Mother Emanuel massacre occurred. Please join us tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the Chapman Auditorium in McNair Science Building at Francis Marion. And thank you very much for coming. And thank you to our panelists.